Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the September Club Night. How much of his life has been dedicated to birds, and not only being paid to work on birds and trying to resurrect threatened species, but also to be involved within this club as the president and on the committee for how long? 14 years. I mean, if he's not a lifetime member, he probably should be. He's obviously involved with engaging with the community. He's been involved with organising the Twitchathon for a long time. Organises pelagic tours regularly. He's just an all-round bit of a bird superstar and hunter. So I think we should welcome him with a big cheer.
What I'm going to talk to you about tonight, I'm going to focus on the captive releases that have been happening for Regent Honeyeaters. But I am going to give a bit of an introduction to the bird and woodland birds generally, just for context. I always, when I give my talks, I assume that there are people in the audience that don't know about this stuff. So I always start by giving some context about woodland birds generally. So our woodlands are incredibly diverse. They contain 250 to 300 bird species, and most importantly, some of them, the obligate woodland birds, they only use that habitat type. Things like diamond firetail and turquoise parrot are a good example. They're one of the most diverse habitats in southeastern Australia. So this is what we're talking about when we think about a woodland. Quite open canopy, lots of different layers in the structure. Importantly, there's quite a lot of fallen timber. That's a very important feature of a woodland. So when you drive the Pacific Highway, or if you look at Google, if you look out the plane as you're coming into Sydney Airport, yeah, there is a lot of bush left in Australia on the eastern seaboard. But a lot of it is along the spur of the Great Divide, or it's these wet forests that were never really cleared because they weren't able to be used for agriculture. So by default, most of our reserves are actually land types or landscapes that were no good to be cleared, and that's why they were spared. However, this habitat type, what we call temperate woodlands, they basically occur on the flats, and that's the areas where there were fertile soils, and that's where agriculture and towns were established. So this is basically when we refer to southeastern temperate Australia, it's pretty much that polygon there, and Tassie's included. But you can see from that there's been a dramatic loss of vegetation within that area, and it's thought that about 85 to 90% of temperate woodlands in that polygon have been cleared, and within the 10 to 15% that remain, most of that is fragmented and guarded by noisy miners and things like that. So it's a very rare habitat, and that's why we have a number of threatened woodland birds. And the most threatened of this suite of woodland birds, and there's probably, by now, there'd probably be around 35, 40 species that are actually listed, at least in New South Wales, as threatened. The most endangered are the Regent Honeyeater and swift parrot. And I have been working on both of those for a little while now. Both are critically endangered at the highest level internationally under the IUCN Red List. So this is the guy we're talking about tonight. This is I'll call it the graph. People may have seen earlier iterations of this graph. I'm just going to duck back. If people can cast their mind back to when Birgitta Hansen last meeting spoke about Latham snipes, and she said that the population estimate is 35,000. I'm like, wow, 35,000. You can take a zero off that, 3,500. You need to take another zero off it to get what the population estimate is for Regent Honeyeaters. So it's thought that there were around, we don't know, it's a best guess, but somewhere around 300 to 350. In fact, 350 is probably at best. But you can see that there was a remarkable decline after the mid-90s. Things have sort of levelled out a bit. 2012 was a bit of a spike because we had a lot of birds locally feeding on spotted gum blossom. Mind you, there were more Regent Honeyeaters in 2012 than there are now.
What's the second?
Oh, sorry. So, yeah, I did have a legend on there. So the blue bar is is the count of birds. These are number of sites. So back in '95, we were getting reports of Regent Honeyeaters from 200 sites, and that's double the amount of birds on average we get reported this year. So, and the other thing is, you know, we're getting reports of birds from, let's say, 30 sites a year. Most of those 30 are just single lone males. Yeah. So it's a bird that used to occur in big flocks. That's how they operated. They would arrive at a big blossom event, throw their weight around like a typical honeyeater really, chase other honeyeaters around. But they're quite fussy, so they're always on the move, and I think that's been to their undoing. Because when you're on the move and you've lost 90% of your habitat, it's not a good strategy. So the range of the bird has contracted markedly. It used to occur as far as Adelaide. It used to breed in suburban Melbourne, but it's now confined to pretty much New South Wales. There are birds hanging on in northeast Vic and northeast Vic and southeast Queensland. But in the last 10 years or so, what we've found is that on average, about 80 to 90% of Regent Honeyeaters are reported within inside that polygon, basically on the periphery of the Greater Blue Mountains. These outlines show the key biodiversity areas. That's Mochi Walla, Blue Mountains. It basically just follows the national park. That's Captivity Valley and that's Lower Hunter. And all of those KBAs include Regent Honeyeater as a trigger species. So this actually shows last year's birds, where we had some flocks at Quarrabulong and Sawpit Road. But what it does is it shows pretty much where every region now breeds. We very rarely get reports of birds breeding outside of those 3 squares. This bird used to be from Adelaide to Bundaberg. So there's something about the Blue Mountains that has enabled this bird to hang on, and I think it's just the myriad of gullies that obviously must have some sort of vegetation and just the protection, I guess, of that massive forested remnant. So now moving to the breed for release. So, you know, when you've got a species that's sort of on a trajectory like it was, the recovery plan identified that we needed to bolster the wild population until it becomes self-sustaining. And a few years ago, the Australian National University did a population viability analysis. That's a PVA. A PVA is basically taking as much data as you can get, putting it through the sausage machine, and out the other end, it maps out the future of the bird. And basically, they concluded that if we did nothing, it would be extinct within 10 years. But the 2 most important things that we can do are protect nests, make sure that we help facilitate their breeding, and release 100 birds every 2 years at least. So this really underpins the survival of this species. So it all started back in 1995. The first regents collected from the wild were actually fledgler nestlings from a nest in Chiltern by a fellow called Richard Mackovix. That's Richard is the nest on that. I was speaking to him this morning about regents. He's still involved. And this photo here, there was a bit of a prototype release of 9 birds in the Captivity Valley in 2000. I'm sure a few people recognise that character. That's David Gearing, the former recovery coordinator. And that's Carol Probitz, another famous Captivity Valley figure, and Tiffany Mason, who also had a stint as a recovery coordinator. It wasn't the most successful of releases, that one, but it was, like I said, it was a prototype. This is just a cool little video of birds coming to Wangaroo feeder at, this is Sydney, you can tell, so that's Dubbo. So Taronga has Regent Honeyeaters at both sites. The Dubbo area is very new, you can see that the Sydney ones are quite old. But yeah, it's pretty cool seeing that many regions together. So far, this is how many birds we've released. So after the sort of experiment in the Captivity, most of the releases then started happening in Victoria. And the theory there, because the range of the bird was basically that, the theory there was to supplement the population at its southern edge to try and keep stop that edge effect, try and keep the population going in Victoria. And they had pretty good success with survival, and there were some breeding events happen, zoo-birds breeding, but there's been no evidence of recovery in Victoria. It's pretty sad. On average, we get reported less than 2 birds a year from Victoria, despite that. So a few years ago, the recovery team thought, let's change the strategy and release into the core of the bird's range, and that's what we've done. There's been one release in the captivity, but most of the releases in New South Wales have been here in the Lower Hunter. So this is a photo I took at a very special property called Ima at Corriblong. This was on the 30th of May 2012. There's 24 regents in that one frame. There were 50 regents. So this is 2012, that spike that you might remember from the graph. We had 100 birds in the Lower Hunter, but 50 of them alone were on this one property. So every now and then, obviously, if you've got a captive population of a bird, you need to have genetic diversity. You can't just use the original founders. So Taronga have a licence to take X birds from the wild. It's roughly 5 birds every 5 years. So in 2012, they did just that because we misnetted 9 regents one morning by putting up mist nets in the dark. We followed the birds the evening before. There were about 8 of us all with walkie-talkies, and we followed them and worked out where they were roosting. And then we got up at 3:30, drove out in the dark and set up mist nets in the dark, and we caught 9 birds. So that same property was actually the one to the north. That was chosen for the first New South Wales release. It was that year. Looks like something from ET. It was only 20 birds though, so it was a very small release. This is Lockie Hall. He's tracking birds, and I am going to talk about tracking in more detail very soon. So the birds really moved around a lot. They didn't stick around. Hardly any birds stayed where they were released. And mortality was very bad. We put transmitters, we tracked 13 out of the 20, and 8 out of those 13 we found had died. So it was not the best way to start, and that's a butcher bird responsible for that. That was on day 3. So it really was not a good way to start the New South Wales releases. So the year after that, it's time to get serious. So the Melbourne woodlands, easily the least fragmented site that regents now breed. So if you cast your mind back to those squares that I had, the Upper Hunter and the captivity, all of those breeding sites are along watercourses, and they're literally one tree wide on each side. They're breeding in river oaks with needle-leaf mistletoe. Here, it's like stepping back 200 years. It's just a solid block of about, let's say 2,500 hectares, and the only fragmentation that is in to Melbourne is this big power easement and this stupid road that someone put in 20 odd years ago. And the amazing thing about to Melbourne is that it's a wintering site as well, because of the fact that spotted gum is one of the co-dominant trees there. So it's a rare site that the birds will winter and they'll breed. So, just thinking back to that need to be mobile, this is a very important site. And again, it's only 30 kilometres from the coast, so presumably, as climate change takes more effect, somewhere that close to the coast is probably going to be a bit safer than, because we've lost some of the breeding habitat in the Bundaberg region. The recent drought really just knocked the river oaks around and all the mistletoe died. So this is a very important site. In some years, it's the only place that we find any evidence of them breeding. Oh yeah, I might mention moving right along. So in early 2021, I started noticing bud forming on various eucalypts. The forest red gum, grey ironbark, which is, probably 3, Sideriflora is probably the main one, broadleaf ironbark and grey gum. So you can see that there's a succession of blossom from basically September into October, November, December, into January, February. And the icing on the cake is that after all of that, the spotted gums were budding as well. And the spotted gum apiarists just love spotted gums because they flower for 5 months sometimes. And that's the thing that brings the flocks of Regent Honeyeaters into the hunter. And so essentially we're going to get 10 or 11 months worth of blossom. And don't forget the mistletoe. It flowers in spring as well. And Regent Honeyeaters feed on the blossom and build nests in the clumps. And by the way, I am going to focus on the 2021 release a bit. I'm not going to talk about every release in this detail. The first release into Melbourne was pretty special. So back in April, I think it was, something like that, we started months of planning. It's I don't know, it's hard to imagine that something, you know, just letting some birds go could take so much planning, but it does, trust me. It's a very big undertaking. And so the zoo promised us 58 birds, and we chose the 21st and the 25th of October. So we did have some challenges, as always, you know, with rain, and this, you know, COVID hadn't gone. In fact, I think COVID was at its worst in 2021. We had, you know, we had to sign it and, you know, all that sort of stuff. But most importantly, this part of the Tamalpin Woodlands is owned by the Minda local Aboriginal Land Council. And we'd already formed a good relationship with them. We'd already started our mistletoe work and various other things. So everything went to plan, and we were able to release on the 21st. And there was a smoking ceremony, and Tara Deva is the CEO. She was applying ochre to people's faces, and it was pretty amazing. And then a really incredible thing happened. Like, this low cloud formed, and Tara had snuck away, and she donned a possum skin cloak, which is a very, very sacred thing. They don't come out in public very often. And she gave a very impassioned speech. Tara is an incredible orator. But that photo hasn't been tinkered with. Like, the sun literally sort of ducked beneath the cloud and shone at it. It was like having a stage light. It was pretty amazing. But before Tara spoke, this is Uncle Richard Edwards. He's a Wanneroo elder. Now, he did the welcome to country, and he welcomed us to country in Wanneroo language. And it's believed that that's the first time that anyone had welcomed a group of people in Wanneroo language on country for 150 years. It was that morning.
Wow.
And so just to sort of complete the loop, the thing that Regent Honeyeaters have become famous for is, you know, and I'm talking like from a global perspective, if you live in the UK, you only know Regent Honeyeaters because of the fact that it's the bird that's using its life song, right? That's the sort of the hook. And it's thought that because there are so few birds left, the lone males separate like the young males, and they're not assimilating with other regents, they're hanging out with other honeyeaters, and hence they're learning the call of other birds. And it's even like, you know, there's even kids' books. And if people haven't seen that, that's behind the news. That is awesome. It's like, I don't know, 7 or 8 minutes, but it's really worth, I think you can see it, yeah, it's on YouTube. It's really worth a watch. They have captured the whole story really well. But yeah, so, you know, kids are being taught this stuff. So it's significant that the Wanneroo language is critically endangered itself. It is almost, like many Indigenous languages, it has almost disappeared. And there are some people at Newcastle University that are in the process of reawakening the Wanneroo language. So to be releasing a critically endangered bird that's losing its song on country where there hadn't been people welcomed in language for 150 years was, yeah, it was just added a whole new element to what we were doing. And we did get some good media out of that, and we had an article screened on the project. And again, that's a screen grab from YouTube. You can YouTube that. It's pretty well done. Like, you know, they give Tara as much of a voice about the cultural significance as the Regents. Yeah, it's really, really good. Oh, so on this, for some reason, there was no volume, no sound for this video. This is a video that the fellow from DQ, so there's Emily Mowat, she preceded Rob Kite now. Rob now fits the transmitters to birds. There's the smoking ceremony. Yeah, the birds flying out of the tents are pretty cool. Some birds just stay in the tents, and you can't do anything until they're all out. To the tracking of the birds. So that's that image that I showed before of Lockie. I think we can pass it around. That's an example of the transmitter. So the way that we track the birds is using very old technology, basically VHF radio, and it's still the best way of doing it. Satellites or nothing else comes close to the accuracy of using one of these. Each morning, the monitoring team have a mission to find as many birds as possible. You know, these birds can fly 10 kilometres or whatever. Yeah, and they're a small bird and they're often in the canopy, so it's the way that these things work. I don't know if people have used or seen these used before, but you're listening for the strongest signal. So what I just showed you there is what happens when a bird dies. Well, because the thing ends up on the ground, and if you've got a signal that doesn't move, you've got to find it, because it could mean a dead bird. And finding dead birds is really important to confirm. Often, because the harnesses that Rob here's literally been making these in the last few days, the harnesses are actually designed to break. We don't want the birds to be carrying these things forever. They're actually designed to break within about 10 weeks. And some of the birds just manage to get out. We have had a couple of instances where they get caught on a twig or something. So yeah, when you get a stationary signal, it's important that you find the transmitter. Hopefully it's just without a bird on it. So the way that VHF technology works is that if you're on a flat piece of ground and you're looking through trees, it's not going to give you anywhere near the amount of range as if you're up high and looking down. So when we release into Melbourne, it's sort of roughly here-ish, and what I've done there is I've exaggerated Google Earth. Thanks, Dan, for that tip. So that's sort of the base of Mount Tumblebee, that's the top. That's another high point, yeah, along the power residents and clearings. And so these are places that the guys that are doing the tracking go each morning. So that's me. Yeah, you can see that by standing there, and like the mountain's quite high, each morning you can sort of get bearings on where the birds are. Some birds don't move much. Some birds are just, you know, they get a reputation. And so the way that we do it is we have a group on WhatsApp, and each morning people will go to high points. So these are maps, screen grabs from a couple of high points, and they will give a sort of a bearing of where they're getting signals from. And on the ground, the guys that are really good at finding birds, that can track down. And so, yeah, so they then have the mission to try and find the bird in that arc. But the best high point there is locally is that one right there, Mount Sugarloaf. And so you can see here, that's Mount to Melbourne there. And this is Mount Tumblebee. This is to Melbourne here. you get a good sense for why the regents are going there. it's pretty flat. And on at least 2 occasions, we have picked up signals from birds that are close to Mount View from Adelaide. That's nearly 20 kilometres. Very faint, but you know, it's pretty good that you can actually pick up a signal from something that small, that far away. Oh, and we did consider. I'd love to do that. I mean, talk about nothing to interfere. So often, you know, all these maps are flying through the WhatsApp chat group, and you know, if you look, this is a screen grab of just the images from one of the chats. It's all these maps. Occasionally there'll be a photo of a bird, and you know, there's all sorts of other things that go in there. But it's quite fun. If you leave the chat for too long, you know, you come back to your phone, there's 120 messages. But it is heaps of fun. I'm kind of mostly the marshal, the sort of back, instructing people where to go. Yeah, because the guys that are on the ground are really good at this stuff. So each release, the birds have a unique colour band combination, so we can tell that if we find a bird with red over metal on their left leg, we know that bird was released in 2021. So these are also, I don't think we're likely to ever find a bird with yellow murder on the right leg. If we know that 8 out of 13 transmitted birds died. And the last one of these birds that we did see was only about 6 weeks after the tracking period. But these are the Melbourne releases, and that's the KP release. And you can see, yeah, that's just basically a visual of one of the, that's 2021. And these are the different codes that are used. And I have put dark blue, blue. Yeah, so I guess with pink, P was already used. So K is used for pink. So every morning, these, so this, I've used the KP to release here because it's a very small cohort. So every morning, this is reset. I think it's, yeah, so that's the colour of every bird appears in the morning. And on the phones, the guys, if they actually get eyes on a bird, not just a signal, if they get eyes on a bird, they put a Y into that column, and that sends the bird green. So the other guys then know, oh, well, I don't need to go and find green. He's been seen for the day. Mauve white, though, on this day, there was a signal for him, but not seen. So a Y goes into that column, and that turns it yellow, which tells the guys that, oh, you know, we've got a signal for him, but he hasn't been seen. So, you know, come 1 o'clock or something, if nobody's had eyes on mauve white, then they'll put in the chat, oh, I'll go and try and find mauve white. Now, so this is every day. And it used to be, the ethics committees used to make us do this for 10 weeks solid. We've now got it back to 5 weeks. But it's a lot of work, and obviously, so these are the birds that are carrying transmitters, so they're easier to find. The ones that don't carry transmitters, that was a good day. We saw four non-transmitter wearing birds, and generally, it's a pretty exaggerated example of captivity, because we do, in every other release we have had females carrying transmitters, but generally more males carry transmitters because they're heavier and able to carry the harness. So there's an example, that's mauve metal, sorry. I feel I've got the wrong way around. Anyway, I'll move on. So 2021, we'll come back to that year now, and straight away, birds were pairing. In fact, we actually think birds were pairing in the tent. So what Taronga did, and this is very, very good thinking, because this is the first spring release they'd ever done. Shelton was always April, then we did June, and Coralblock. This was the very first spring release. And so they thought, oh, right, you know, nature's going to take its course. And they separated all the boys and girls. So all the boys went to Dubbo, all the girls stayed in Sydney. So when they converged, in those tents into Melbourne, I mean, it's no wonder that the birds came out and, yeah, straight away we saw nests being built. Some of the nests are pretty special. You know, but you've got to hand it to them, like, they are tenacious. So they're both different nests, different females. But to be fair though, it wasn't just about poor nest construction. We had some really bad luck. I don't know if you remember, late 2021, there was just storm after storm after storm, and we had 2 zoo birds with chicks almost falling out of the nest. They were going to fledge the next day, and a thunderstorm just wiped them out. It's like, oh, just incredibly frustrating. But there was one successful nest. Butterfly. So that was the first time instance of released Regent Honeyeaters breeding. So I've only spoken about the zoo birds in 2021. I'm just going to focus quickly on the wild birds. So I found the first pair on the 17th of August, which was pretty early, and we had the first nest was started to be built on the 9th of September. But we didn't find chicks, that nest failed. The first nest that we found with chicks in it was on the afternoon of the 20th of October. So you remember on the 21st, that was the first release day. And Max Breckenridge had found the nest, and after the release, and all the hoo-ha, we thought, right, let's go and check the nest. And we're looking up in the tree, and we're like, expecting to see adult Regent Honeyeaters come into a nest. You see that thing flapping on the ground? And eventually, we saw the male come to a low branch and then go down to the ground with food. It's like, oh, right. Apologies to those who get motion sickness. I mean, it's handheld. Look at that. And eventually the male comes in. So, there's the nest. So, what must have happened is overnight something's predated the nest. The nest has fallen out of the tree, the other chick was taken, and this chick was left on the ground. It had a broken leg, and it went back to Taronga. And I'm pleased to report, because it's a girl, female Regent Honeyeaters are so precious, and she's been breeding like crazy. She's pumped out a dozen babies since. So it's a kind of a good ending, but it gives you a sense of just how frustrating it is, because some years we don't find a single nest. Most years we have half a dozen maybe, and just to see one fail like that, yeah. Anyway, so 2021, as you remember, with all those gum trees, the buds, Regents, the wild Regents, they just kept breeding right into January. In fact, the last pair, their chicks fledged on the 25th of January, which is the latest any Regent Honeyeater has been recorded fledging chicks. And you remember that the first nest was starting to be built on the 9th of September. That is a ridiculous amount of time for this species to be breeding. A similar thing happened in 2007. Melbourne woodlands are completely unique. Now, anyway, there may have been other sites like this 200 years ago, but now this is such an important site. Then something really cool happened. We started getting these communal roosts, and so the guys would go out, and we only knew this because we fitted. So once the battery started dying on some of the transmitted birds, we went out, misnetted again by doing this, go into a roost, and we put on a couple of new transmitters on a couple of birds, and that enabled us to follow them longer. And those transmitter birds led us to 2 roosts. One, which is called the blocks one. This is sort of in the middle, that's sort of in the north. In this photo, there's about 7 regents. So, you can see here, new wild juvenile. These are all zoo birds, and there's wild juveniles roosting with zoo birds. At its peak, we had nearly 20 birds at each roost. We had 40 Regent Honeyeaters that we knew the whereabouts of, and we watched them over summer, which has never been done before. No one has ever watched regents over a summer period. Generally, that's when they disappear. So, and they persisted, so they started feeding on the grey gum in summer, and then by the time the spotted gum started, they were still around in March, etc. So, fast forward to the 3rd of August. The 3rd of August was the last day that we saw regents into Melbourne, and there were 17 of them. 11 wild, it was a mixed flock of 11 wild birds and 6 zoo birds. So we nearly went 12 months, which is just absolutely incredible with regents. And potentially that's the longest period of time that that species has been in the one spot. Okay, so we're just going to move a bit quicker. How long enough time? I haven't a clue how long we're going to talk. Okay.
I don't think we can.
So the following year, the ironbarks, remarkably, the ironbarks voted for a second year only. That doesn't happen very often, but they did. So we called another release, and so when we did this release, it was different to 21. We didn't know the whereabouts of any wild birds, and the presence of wild birds isn't necessarily a precursor for doing a release. Okay, it's a bonus, but it's not necessarily a precursor for doing it. And so we did this release, and one of the guys was tracking a zoo bird, and he put his binoculars up, and there's a bird with bare legs. So we have wild birds. And then something that, in all that breeding activity that happened in 21, attempted breeding by the zoo birds, all those pairs were zoo-zoo, and all the pairs of the wild birds were wild-wild. Pretty unusual in hindsight, because straight away in 2022, the first pair we had, that's a zoo female and a wild male. And there she is, blue-yellow. She started building a nest, 2 nests, and she did start incubating, and there was another wild pair nearby. They also built a nest, she incubated. Neither nest lasted more than 4 days. Both nests failed, but in 2022, that was it. 2 failed nests were the only evidence of any attempted breeding that we could find. Obviously, we don't cover the entire breeding range of the bird, but to not find any successful nest is pretty scary. Oh, okay, here's another. So I joked about the balloon, but we did have some missing birds in 2022. And this is actually a method that's of tracking wildlife is using aircraft. And we did find one. So the guys got a signal, just like I was doing then. They got a signal from one of our regents over near Sweetman's Creek. And then the plane landed and they got in the cars and they found the bird. A reasonably expensive process, but then again, you cover a humongous amount of ground. You can go to the captivity of that to see if birds have gone there. And we came across, this is Phil Unigan, and he's the fellow that Millie Formby made good friends with, and where she built her microlight. So Phil looked after us. Then in April, so 2022, we kind of lost track of most birds. Then we found 2 juveniles. So that you can see the brown feathers there. That bird was hatched in that season. So even though we had those 2 nests that failed, they bred somewhere. And I don't know, the chances are it was probably somewhere in the Lower Hunter. But the interesting thing was that there were zoo birds as well, feeding on Banksia oblongifolia, which had never been recorded before. And this is some great footage by Steph of one of the zoo birds getting really stuck into the Banksia. And it was just alive with honeydew. I think there were 15 species of honeydew. Never recorded before. So we're kind of learning things about the species from birds that are bred in captivity. And those species, I don't think it flowers well with this but it's become a very popular spot now. Rarely is there like 2 or 3 days without an eagle who's coming from outside. But Steph did find a crescent honeyeater there earlier this year, yeah, which is pretty amazing. So we're now into 2023, and early in the season, things were looking good in the captivity. So these photos are taken along the captivity river. Birds were breeding, but we had some lone male birds calling to no one. So, before I get to that, excitingly though, we found 2 of our Melbourne females in the captivity. Orange Rare, Mick Roderick from 2021 release, 22 release, and an RMPP, so Red Metal Green from the 21 release. Both of them were paired with wild males, which is just amazing. So RMPP was quite famous amongst the tracking team because she made 5 attempts at breeding in 2021 and failed. She was last seen, so we sort of broke for Christmas. She probably just flew off the nest, but presumably the nest failed. But she was last seen sitting on eggs into Melbourne in late December. Then in September 2023, we find her in the captivity, paired with a mate. So persistence pays off for Red Metal Green, because there she is, with two fledglings. And that, I just love that photo. It's just incredible. So that was a zoo wild pairing and 135 k's from the release site. So because there were lone males in the valley, or basically in the national park, we decided, let's just do a really small release of mostly, that's wrong, I think it was the other way around, 8 males, 6 females. In an effort to try and get those males to pair with the more females. Okay, so the theory was, you got low males, we released most females and try and get them pairing. It didn't work because we did it too late. By the time we got organised, and Toronto, to their credit, did it as quickly as they could, it was mid-November. It was just too late for birds to pair. And elsewhere, so there was breeding in the captivity, but we also had a nest, or maybe 2 in the Wind Valley, which is in the Upper Hunter. There's the team watching the release. Rob was very heavily involved by this stage, and now is a key player in this whole story. A couple of birds did go to the zoo. So meanwhile over in the Widden, so this is the female of that pair that bred successfully in 2021. There's no photo, but she was paired with a wild male. Like, she left her zoo partner and found a different place. So in 2024, there was another 2022 bird arrived in a place called Emu Heights in the western outskirts of Sydney, and he was with they weren't necessarily a pair, but that was a wild bird. Then last year, we found a flock of 12 birds, and there were 3 2022 birds in that flock, and one of these juveniles, because we caught both of those juvenile birds abandoning. And one of those birds was with this mixed flock at Ima. And another gong to Steph. Steph, in I think it was early June last year, discovered some regents at a place called Saltpit Road, just south of Pocket Park. And I think, I don't know, you may have had half a dozen that first morning, but the maximum count, and there were many counts of at least a dozen, but the maximum count was 17 birds in that flock, and all of them had bare legs, which is great. So we did release last year because the spotted gunner stone. This was a different type of Tamalpi release because it was basically a late winter one. And my theory was that it was late enough in winter because spring generally starts around like the 10th of August, something like that. That the birds would stick around and potentially breed, insects would emerge, etc. It didn't quite go to plan because the spotted gun into Melbourne it failed. All the spotted guns everywhere else were pumping, but into Melbourne they weren't. And so a lot of birds did move. But incredibly, and again, like 2022, we had no idea, like nobody had found any regents into Melbourne last year. We found them at Pelton, Kitchener, Quadralong, but the day, and Rob was there, the day that the zoo birds got driven in, because the tents were all set up, and the birds came out of their tents and out of their cages, out of their boxes, put in the tents, and 2 wild Regent Honeyeaters just came in and flew in over the top of the tents. So presumably they heard these birds calling in they flew. And another funny thing was that when Tara and Uncle Richard were speaking, there were swift parrots in the trees literally above them. And all that stuff. Only that could happen in Melbourne, seriously. And eventually, one of those females that we released joined that flock of 17 birds. Not long before that flock disbanded. And that flock was most definitely male dominated. I reckon at least 12 out of the 17 would have been male. It was very male dominant. And that's the story with Regent Honeyeaters. There is a distinct lack of females in the wild population, and that's why I say females are precious. And, you know, it's significant, I think, that all the pairings of wild and zoo have been a zoo girl with a wild male. Oh yeah, so then a few of our birds went to some interesting places. This is just too hard to believe, but Ross, Crates and Liam Murphy, they had nothing to do with the release. They were just doing surveys, searches for Regent Honeyeaters, and they were in a valley in Putty. And the method that we use when we survey for regents is we play calls to maximise the chances of detection. And they played a call in the middle of, and one of our zoo birds flew in that had been released here about 6 weeks earlier. So that there,
They've got a good hearing.
and they're bloody quick. So that there is the Captivity National Park. That's where the breeding happens mostly in the Captivity now, and that's Melbourne. And look at this. The shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. I reckon that's amazing.
Yes.
We didn't find that bird subsequently in the Captivity, but who knows where these birds go. We did have another 2022 bird arrive in the Captivity last year, but he remained single. There was a female from the previous release in the Captivity around. So remember we've already spoken about RNDP, who tried hard in 2021, got chicks out in 2023. So last year, here she is again, 5 metres from where she nested the year before. The nest is in there, I think that's your photo, right? And she did it again. And she had paired with a different male, wild male. We know that because we banded that wild male. So, amazing that, you know, I think we can make this work. We just need more birds.
Yeah.
And one of those 3 2022 birds from Quadralong last year, she was found with a wild male, and they bred and got at least 1 chick. And that's in that, on the Golden River. So completely, one's in the Captivity, one's in the Golden River. So they're not going to the same places. I was just like, so this year, in Victoria, there are still birds persisting. So this guy here, Worm, white nose red male, he was released on the 15th of April in 2015. You've seen again in 21, 23, even before that. But he was photographed a few weeks ago. So he's been out for more than 10 years. It's good, but he could be on his own, which is not, it's pretty sad, really.
Yeah.
But there might still be some regents kicking around down there. And just a few weeks ago, I was back at Imar, and I found that this is the first bird here, from this season. In fact, not the only one so far, and this is a male from the 2022 release. So we are seeing birds again, and in the Captivity, there's another. So that bird was released in the Captivity, seen again in the Captivity last week. Okay, sort of coming to the conclusions, etc. So the highlights, I think, are the assimilations that we're seeing. So every time, except for two, so I don't know, there might be 13 or 14 birds we've seen post-release. Every time except two, these two birds have been with wild birds. And I think that's exactly what we want to happen. So they're assimilating. Some are adventurous too. Like we had a bird turn up at Red Rock, 350 k's from the release site. But last year, one of our birds that we'd only just released turned up at a place called Nethercote, which is 470 kilometres from to Melbourne. Second longest distance ever recorded for a region. I've already played this to you guys. This is what some of the zoo birds sound like before we started tutoring them. They make some really bizarre sounds. And so this is one of those zoo birds that we found in Coralong. Take a word for it. The call that bird is doing is very similar to a wild male. It didn't sound anything like that at the time of release. And there were 12 birds. So that male has learned, even though Ross says that the calls they're doing these days are more simple than they were 50 years ago. That's true. But there is still a wild call out there, and this bird has learned that from those wild males he's been hanging around with. So again, that it's something that is working. So this is just the graph again. This is the era of the Victorian releases, and this is when we've done the New South Wales releases. And there's certainly, there's no evidence of recovery yet. But importantly, and banging the drum about to Melbourne again, that these are all the different releases with confirmed mortalities. We don't know exactly how many mortalities there are each release, obviously, because birds that don't carry a transmitter, they can just disappear. We don't know if they've died or not. But for confirmed mortalities, the three releases we've done into Melbourne, the mortality has been very low. Like, only 2 confirmed mortalities out of 58 is remarkable. When you do releases of captive bred animals, any sort, you expect to lose 20%.
Is that, obviously a good sign, but is it also too that you've learned a lot?
Maybe, honestly,
Combined with that,
I think it's the site.
Yeah.
Because these other places, the captivity is very fragmented, and there are a lot of currawongs and ravens. It's a very fragmented landscape. Whereas to Melbourne, it's actually there's more small honeyeaters than you know what to do with, and so the predators don't really get a look in there. It's a very natural and balanced ecosystem because it's not fragmented. It's just a big block of forest. So, and there's no noisy miners in there either. But the noisy miners are only along the power easement and along the road. So, yeah. Okay, what next? So, we are planning to do another release this year. So there was an article in the ABC, I don't know, a couple of months ago. It's happening again. So, out there into Melbourne, it's looking the same, if not better, than 2021. There is going to be a succession of blossoms starting soon that will run until August next year. It is going to be pumping out there. So we are planning to release some more birds. And Curry, being the town of murals, I thought, God, we've got to do it. That's the old Empire Hotel. For people who may not know, that's where the overpass is to go into Pelham. We approached the owner, and thankfully she said yes. And we got the best. We got Jenny McCracken, who is just an incredible artist. She specialises in illusionist art, pavement art. And yeah, this is obviously a time lapse of her doing pretty. But yeah, no, that's a very big Regent Honeyeater. And we've now, Rob put together a sign, and there is a sign across the road. But you can see there that she's drawn the bird on the downpipe.
Yeah.
Now, if you go across the road, there is a certain, so this is taken from the same side of the road as the mural. There's a power pole. I don't know if, can you guys see those there? They're claws. So what she did is, she got into a cherry picker. She did the whole thing with the cherry picker, but she got up and she painted claws onto the power pole. So when you stand at a certain point, it looks like that giant Regent Honeyeater is perched on the power pole. Yeah. It's worth a look. It's like 23 minutes drive from here. It's yeah, go and see it. So yeah, that's me.
I'm assuming there'll be questions. Or maybe I shoot wrong.
Yeah, Mick, you mentioned that it was not recorded or known or experienced that the wild birds were now getting to the banks of Banksia. Is there any thought on that?
They had been found feeding in other species of Banksias, but still not commonly.
So wild or the...
Yeah, the wild.
Yeah.
So we do have a lot of data on the diets of Regent Honeyeaters. There's been, at least a couple of PhDs, and the bird was so abundant for so long that, white box, yellow box, they have their favourite trees are basically white box, yellow box, mugger ironbark inland, and spotted gum and swamp hog on the coast. And then after those 5 eucalypts, you probably move to maybe some stringy barks and some of the other ironbarks. But after that, it would be callistemons and grevilleas. Banksias would be way down. Yeah, they're just like. But having said that, part of me now is thinking, because I did intimate that we have a knowledge gap about what they do post breeding. Maybe they go feed on Banksias in Wollongong National Park on the ridges. Like we don't expect them to use sandstone ridges, but maybe that's where they go in summer and they feed on Banksias.
What were they being fed in the zoo when they were for the captive stuff? Was that a mixture of something?
Yeah, that's Wombaroo.
So, yeah.
But
and does that sort of take their, or sort of have something to do with their taste? And so then when they go wild, there's a different, they're looking for something different?
Potentially, but a couple of things. They do collect, like the zoo staff do collect local blossom, so they are fed nectar. The Wombaroo is just like to make sure that they have sustenance. But these zoo birds, like some of them, like the ones in Sydney, they would never in their lives have ever seen mistletoe, right? They wouldn't know what it is, and they go straight to it.
Something.
Thanks, Mick.